Hello, and welcome everyone to this third segment of Stay at Home, a new series from Jacobin magazine where Monday through Saturday, 6 days a week at 6 p.m. Eastern, we'll be talking with a left-wing thinker who will present and then take questions from those of you who are watching live. My name is Christy Offenbacher. I'm a clinical social worker and a psychoanalyst here in New York, where I also organize with DSA's National Medicare For All campaign and am an editor at Damage magazine. Today we have Ronan Burtenshaw, editor-in-chief of Tribune and former European editor of Jacobin. His article on tonight's topic, titled Summoning the Future, is available on the Jacobin website. Tribune will also be soon publishing a special issue on the coronavirus pandemic. Keep an eye out for that. You can find their articles at tribunemag.co.uk. And for those of you who might not yet know about the Tribune, it has its own quite interesting and relevant history. Tribune was founded in 1937 as part of the campaign to build a popular front against fascism in Britain in solidarity with the struggle in Spain. Over the next few decades, it became the voice of the labor left and included major party figures like Stafford Cripps, Barbara Castle, Harold Lasky, Jenny Lee, and Michael Foot amongst its editors and contributors. But the publication is probably most associated with Aneurin Bevan, who edited it during the 1940s while a Labour MP under Clement Attlee. During this period, Bevan campaigned against the appeasement of Hitler and for a people's war to mobilize the working class against fascism. He held the Labour left in Parliament and edited Tribune right up until 1945, when he became the Minister of Health. As a Medicare For All organizer here in the US, I can say that I am especially excited for tonight's segment, in which Ronan will speak to the explicitly class struggle politics that led to the formation of the British National Health Service. This is a truly fascinating and, at least on this side of the pond, little known, little appreciated history that holds important lessons for organizing for a Medicare For All single payer system here in the US. Tomorrow, Jacobin's Stay at Home series is taking the day off, but on Monday, we will have Karen Narewski on the case for public housing and why new public housing construction has to be part of the left's demands. And with that, I will hand it off to Ronan.
Thank you very much, Christy. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in. I can't see you from this end, but I'll assume you're all looking very well. You've cleaned your rooms, you're surviving the quarantine and whatever else. Welcome to what by this time for me is very definitely a Saturday night socialism. It is 10 p.m. here in London, so I will do my level best to be more coherent than I usually am at this hour of a Saturday night. This topic for me is a fascinating one, a great one, not only because it allows me to talk a little bit about one of my heroes, Aneurin Bevan, but also because it reminds us in the face of this global pandemic that we're all facing now, of the struggles behind the victories that won national health services and proper public health systems, how difficult that was and how important it was, how political it was for so much of the 20th century. And in that context, I think it's worth starting off by doing a bit of an introduction into what the hell Britain's health service was like before the NHS came along. So in the earliest part of the 20th century, Britain's health service was dominated by this network of workhouse infirmaries, or what had just replaced workhouse infirmaries, that were set up under the Poor Law in 1834. It was a law that was quite clear in its ambition, not to improve greatly or in any kind of sense on behalf of working people or poor people the conditions, but to make sure that they didn't fall to indolence and vice, which was the terminology used in the Commission report to set up the Poor Law. The famous medical journal, The Lancet, in the 1850s, when it was doing an assessment of these workhouse infirmaries, was scathing about the quality of the infirmaries, calling them a disgrace to our civilization. They said they sin by their construction, by their want of nursing, by their comfortless fittings, by the supremacy which is accorded to questions of expense, by the imperfect provision made for skilled medical attendance on the sick, by the immense labour imposed on the medical attendants and the wretched pittances which they are ground down. This system was deeply unpopular. It had terrible healthcare outcomes, and there were constant struggles against it and demands for improvement. But for the most part, for many, many decades, these were frustrated. The Workhouse Infirmaries were in 1929 under the Local Government Act. They were partially municipalized, so you did get some degree of public responsibility for these things. But all the way through, there was big resistance to reforms. And the really excellent historian whose book I recommend, Charles Webster, who's the official historian of the NHS and wrote a book called The Political History of the Nhs, which people should pick up. He summed it up this way. He said that the path to the NHS was by no means inevitable. Any step towards the translation of pious sentiments regarding healthcare into practicable objectives was liable to expose clashes of ideological loyalty and stir up conflict between vested interests. So the NHS in this period really was a kind of wilderness. You had the vast majority of healthcare provided on the primary care basis by independent GPs. They were free to operate where they wanted at the start of the 20th century. So these general practitioners would concentrate in very affluent areas and leave very little healthcare provision for the poorer parts of the country. There was a divide between the municipalized workhouse infirmary style hospitals, which I mentioned before, and the private charitable hospitals, which grew year on year in their size because of the lack of public and municipal investment. A Ministry of Health was set up in 1919, but really it had very little national remit in its early years because the local governance insisted upon maintaining a fragmented system. There were all of these fiefdoms around the various hospitals, the private charitable organizations and so forth. And so the Ministry of Health did exist, but wasn't really in charge of any kind of national system. There was over many decades, from the late 1800s into the early, the late 1800s into the early 1900s, 20th century, a series of public health legislation that was passed. It started with things like cholera and typhus, trying to control outbreaks of which now I suppose we all have a sense of what they look like. And it also brought in a number of what they would have called healthcare adjacent services. So you were looking at public baths, street cleaning, maternity wards was classified in the healthcare adjacent, and various other things. So there was a kind of a general context of public health legislation that was created. And there was also the School Medical Inspection Service, which was sent around schools to look after the poorer children and make sure there was some degree of healthcare provided to them. But as the 20th century rolled on, past its first decade and into its second, the importance of these voluntary systems, the charitable hospitals and so on, grew. And these were, to say the very least, unsatisfactory ways of providing healthcare for working class people. They were funded in large part by flag days, which were attended by celebrities and royals. Incidentally, again, the very same people who today are able to access private medical care for their coronavirus tests, when the vast majority of the population is not, in fact, including frontline NHS staff. Doctors often volunteered in these charitable hospitals on the basis that they were teaching hospitals or that they were getting paid from the largesse of some massive philanthropist. But of course, with very few controls in place, that teaching often ended up meaning borderline experimentation on poorer and more working class patients. How these were funded was largely, as I said, through the system of flag days and private philanthropy. There was, in 1911, there was introduced the first National Insurance Act in Britain. This was modelled very much on Otto von Bismarck's model in Germany. But it was extremely limited. So up until 1911, there was next to no guaranteed provision for people in terms of healthcare. After 1911, there was some, but it was tied to your place of work. It was only for workers. It only had GP or general practitioner care. And by all the way in 1938, by the time that the Second World War kicks off, only 43% of the entire population were even covered by that. So you can see just how narrow the provision was. And at the time, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie, condemned the 1911 Act as a porous plaster to cover the disease that poverty causes. Of course, not under that act, as I'd said, were hospitals. So while you had general practitioners who were covered to some degree, you didn't end up with any hospitals being covered. So the hospitals still ended up charging people. There was no insurance system for hospitals. And what happened in hospitals was you had an almoner, so somebody who would take charitable donations, basically, from people to cover the cost of their hospital visit. Now, the almoner was essentially sent out to assess people's needs and what had to happen for them to cover their costs. So if people were poor in particular, they would be brought in front of the almoner, who would ask them what their means were, how much money they had, if they had any property, what jobs they had, and so on. And they were often pretty ruthless in how they would assess people's needs. So one example that I can give from a patient at the time, a maternity patient called Doris Huffling, she spoke to the BBC many decades later about how important the NHS was and her experience before it. And this is how she described the almoner. The almoner asked what we earned. She wanted the lot at first. I said, we can't afford that. We'll need to get clothes and food for the baby. This is when she was coming in when she was pregnant. Unfortunately, the baby died. And a couple of days later, the almoner came into the ward with a typical caring attitude and said, now that you've lost the baby, maybe you can pay more. So this was what working class people faced in Britain before the arrival of the NHS. It was a miserable system, a system that was punitive, a system that was designed to allow rich people to have private care in their own homes, often through direct GP access, while the working mass of the population had to rely upon substandard care. Despite all this, there was resistance right the way through to state involvement in healthcare from the ruling classes. There was a lack of investment in vaccines, which meant in the decade before the Second World War kicked off, thousands of children were dying from preventable illnesses. They were dying from pneumonia, they were dying from meningitis and tuberculosis, and there was a massive outbreak of polio. In fact, in 1934, a government assessment found that 80% of the children in the poorest parts of Durham, which is a northern mining part of England, and in London, showed signs of rickets. So the public health situation in the country was dire, to say the least. And that all came at the same time as a growing working class and left-wing movement, which sought to transform British society in the interests of working people. The Labour Party and the TUC had adopted positions in favour of national health services long before the NHS was built. But there wasn't just at national level, there was also very interesting local groups. One example was the Workers' Birth Control group, established by women in mining areas, with the slogan, "It's 4 times as dangerous to bear a child as to work down a mine." But the most important of these groups by far were the friendly societies. So the friendly societies were vast mutual societies that were set up in almost exclusively in working class areas by working class communities to try to provide healthcare for the huge sections of the population who had no access to decent care. And the most prominent of these was in a Welsh mining village called Tredici. The Tredici Mutual Aid Society was set up by miners and iron workers. It covered women, children. As it grew over the years, it ended up covering mental health for the first time and also building its own hospital. by the time that the Second World War came around, 23,000 of the 24,000 residents of Tredici were covered by the scheme. And the scheme, of course, had a famous disciple, a son of Tredici, An Bevan. And Bevan saw the friendly society, this Tredici Mutual Aid Society, develop, and he saw the benefits for a working class community. Bevan himself had about half of his siblings pass away before adulthood, and he was not even of the poorest sections of the population in Tredici. Bevan had worked in the mines. He hadn't gone to secondary school. His mother and father at the time hadn't thought himself smart enough. And he had seen in Tredici the extraordinary poverty that faced working class communities. And what he said about it when he was involved in the building of the NHS, he had a very famous quote. "I am determined," he said, "to extend to the entire population of Britain the benefits we had in Tredici for a generation or more. We are going to Trediciize you." And that was the mission An Bevan set himself in politics. At the time, it's worth remembering, as Christy was saying in the introduction, the development of the campaign for a proper national health service and public health care in Britain came directly alongside the rise of the labour movement and the working class movement. So much so, in fact, that it grew and accelerated at the points that the labour movement increased, and it declined when the labour movement struggled. So the labour movement in Britain was rising at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1912, it had conducted mass strikes and won the first of a kind of minimum wage in the country. The first attempt at unity was in 1914. It's what was called the Triple Alliance between miners, railwaymen and transport workers. And that provided an enormous amount of strength to the labour movement and coordination amongst trade unionists. They were doing things like sympathy strikes, which we now are forbidden from doing by Britain's draconian trade union laws. And through that period, until the end of that decade, there was a big increase in labour militancy and working class activity, culminating in 1919, 1920, big strike waves in the trains and the coal fields and so on, and various fears amongst the ruling elite about the prospect of rising Bolshevism in Britain. The Labour Party at the same time grew extraordinarily too. So in 1910, Labour had received around 300,000 votes, but by 1918, with the rise of this broader Labour movement, it received 2.2 million votes in that election. And this pressure resulted in the government beginning to take more serious action and consideration around healthcare reform. So you had in 1920 the Dawson Report, which for the first time the government began to consider the prospect of doing things on a national level. In 1926 there was a Royal Commission which looked at the healthcare system and for the first time argued that there was going to be some need for public provision and public funding rather than just a centralisation. But as I said, the consequences of what happened in the labour movement at that time were very important to all of these developments, because the pressure that had been building up until 26 began to dissipate. There was the massive defeat for the labour movement in the general strike and the poor political coordination of that. And then in 1931, there was the infamous betrayal of Ramsay MacDonald, who was in as the first Labour Party Prime Minister, when he pursued an Austerian road in response to the Great Depression and broke with his own party to form a national government. And Labour subsequently got hammered in the election, and all of this delayed massively the action by the state to produce better public health policies. There's no question about it. There is this increase in pressure that then gets lifted by both the defeat of the labour movement in 26 and by the rightward turn in the early 30s. But at that time, there were other important projects going on for the development of the NHS. One was the foundation of the Socialist Medical Association in 1930 as a kind of the left wing split from the Medical Service Association. And by 1934, the Socialist Medical Association, which was a group of left-wing and actually led by socialist doctors, by 1934 they'd managed to get their policies made mostly the Labour Party manifesto on this question, which was advocating for a proper national system that would be publicly funded and so on. But it wasn't until World War II, after the defeats in the 20s and 30s, it wasn't until World War II that you could really say that the impetus picked up again from the early 20s. Obviously, faced with the catastrophe of World War II and the mass bombing campaign by the Nazis, it was impossible for the government to accept that there would be such an atomized and inefficient health service. So you ended up with something called the Emergency Hospital Service, which was for the first time the hospitals being brought in under the Ministry of Health. Even though they continued to have independent boards, there was some degree of central control. And in some ways you could say that the Luftwaffe had managed to produce conditions for the rationalization of the British health system, which its planners had failed to produce for many decades previously. This was not something that surprised Anaya and Bevan. Bevan was a big fan of Marx's writing on the Crimean War and made the case at the time, quoting Marx, this is from Marx's writing on the Crimean War, as exposure to the atmosphere reduces all mummies to instant dissolution, so war passes supreme judgment upon social systems that have outlived their vitality. And this was Bevan's perspective at the time, that this great upheaval was a moment where social systems which were going to be proven ineffective would fall away. Bevan, at the time the Second World War kicked off, he had been an MP for Abergwyl in Wales for quite a period of time. He was widely considered to be the most important, at least, orator on the left, if not the outright leader of the left in Parliament. He was condemned for his rhetoric criticising the policies of the Tory government throughout that period. He was condemned by Winston Churchill as a squalid nuisance, something which Bevan himself considered quite an honour later on in his life. He had grown up, as I said, in a mining village. He had gone to work in a mine, but he'd really been educated by the labour and trade union movement. In fact, it was at a labour college that he first really developed his politics and was part of an organisation called the Plebs, which was a left-wing break even within the Labour College. And it was there that he first began to write about Marx and Marxism. And he wrote a fantastic appreciation of the Communist Manifesto, in which it clarified the politics that Bevan was really to carry with him his whole life. Bevan would describe himself as a Marxist, but he was always a democratic socialist in the broader scheme of things. He believed that Marx, to some degree, had underestimated the power of political democracy, and while class struggle was the fundamental political question of any era, and socialism meant the full common ownership of the economy, that the way to achieve this was through mass political parties and winning elections and so forth. And he was a critic of more insurrectionary models. But he did say, and he was quite an impressive writer about Marxism at various times in his life. He said that Marxism had put into the hands of the working class of the 20th century the most complete blueprints for political action it had ever seen. And he said if he had had any training at all, it was in Marxism. So this was the background politically of Anaya and Bevan, who then, of course, as Christy was saying, became one of the figures in the founding of Tribune when he was arguing for a popular front with the other parties of the left, particularly, obviously, the communists, throughout the early stages of the Second World War. In fact, he was expelled from the Labour Party, something which the party itself doesn't talk about much now, when it frames Bevan as this kind of general popular figure of the party, as if he was not a socialist firebrand, but some kind of middle-of-the-road centre-left figure. He was expelled in 1939 for sharing platforms with the communists and arguing that the approach to the war in Britain should be a people's war approach and a class struggle approach. And he had an excellent quote of Churchill. He obviously was part of the Labour left, who were opposed to the appeasement of Hitler at that time, and so they were more favourable to have Churchill as a leader instead of Chamberlain. But he was very clear-sighted about Churchill, what he meant as a figure to lead the country during the Second World War, and his limitations. And he said that Churchill had, of course, led the country in the war, but what he did not do, and what he could not do, as a spokesman of his order and of his class, and that order and that class is dying. And it was, of course, I'm sure, comments like this which provoked Churchill to the squalid nuisance description in the years that followed. When the Second World War ended, there was a really tumultuous election results. Churchill, the great leader of the British war effort, this figure who had been celebrated and is still celebrated internationally for what, for his speeches and so forth during that period, in addition to his leading the military effort, was defeated, and the Tories were defeated. And Bevan's view throughout the Second World War was shown to be prescient, that actually this moment where the society was mobilized en masse and great changes were brought forward, there was much more rationalization, coordination of the economy, but also a degree of empowerment for working class people in taking the fight on themselves in their own communities, that this had produced a massive demand that said, we are not going back. We are not going back to the years before the Second World War, to the squalor, to the poverty. We're not going back to the substandard housing, to the lack of healthcare. And amazingly, the Labour Party won a phenomenal victory in 1945 under the leadership of Clement Attlee, and the Tories were kicked out of power. And probably even more remarkable was that Nye Bevan, who was not a part of the wartime coalition, was made a minister and Minister of Health. And it is a signal of the power of the organised labour movement and of the socialist movement in the country at that time, that somebody who was such a left-wing radical by comparison to his colleagues in the Parliamentary Labour Party was given such an important brief. Bevan had very clear principles for what he wanted to achieve in this period as Minister for Health, and he would write about them years later in a book called In Place of Fear, which I highly recommend people read. It's one of his seminal works. He wrote, a free health service is pure socialism, and as such it is opposed to the hedonism of capitalist society. To call it something for nothing is absurd, because everything has to be paid for in some way or another. But it does mean that the service is there to be used at the time when you need it without payment anxieties. To put it another way, you provide, when you are well, a service that will be available if and when you fall ill. It is therefore an act of collective goodwill and public enterprise, and not a commodity privately bought and sold. It takes away a whole segment of private enterprise and transfers it to the field of public administration. And in this way, brought with him, I think my connection's out. Now, Bevan is somebody clearly who brought with him at that time an ideological perspective into that role as the Minister of Health, as somebody who believed in decommodifying healthcare and taking it out of the predations of the market, making it available to all people on the basis that health service should be public, should be universal, should be free. When Bevan became the Minister of Health, unsurprisingly, the civil service tried to clip his wings. He was warned from the beginning against radicalism. His what was called the permanent private secretary over here, who was the person, the attaché to him in the civil service, warned him about all of the experience of previous ministers of health and their inability to produce any change, and told Nye Bevan that he should not expect things to be any different for him. By that time, as Charles Webster wrote, the health system in the country had effectively been annexed. The power of it had been annexed by the professionals, by the doctors. They had annexed policy making, Webster wrote in his Political History of the Nhs, by a process of permanent negotiation. So rather than any broad-based reforms being introduced, what was happening was year on year, month on month, a process of negotiation with what was a very right-wing and pro-capitalist British Medical Association, who were opposed to fundamental change in the system. There was in 1942 something called the Beverage Report, which was important. It was done by a liberal economist, but understandably, because it was done by a liberal economist, it was much more limited than Bevan's vision. The Beverage Report was really important for bringing the kind of moral case for the welfare state and for building a popular audience for that moral case for the welfare state. But it did not advocate a free system. It was one based on an insurance model, and it was opposed to Bevan's ambition to decommodify. And I think now we can have a little bit of audio of Nye Bevan talking about his perspective on why you needed to decommodify healthcare, to give you a sense of how his vision contrasted with the insurance model that liberals like Beveridge proposed.
I'm proud of it. It's a piece of real Christianity too. You know. We had to wait a long time for it. What I had in mind when we organized the National Health Service in 1946 to 1958, and remember when we did it, you know, you younger ones, this is immediately after the end of the Second World War, when we were asked, Sir Winston Churchill then said, a bankrupt nation. But nevertheless, we did these things. And there is nowhere in any nation in the world, communist or capitalist, any health service to compare with it. Now, the National Health Service had two main principles underlining it. One, that the medical arts of science and of healing should be made available to people when they needed them, irrespective of whether they could afford to pay for them or not. That was the first principle. The second was that this should be done not at the expense of the poorer members of the community, but of the well-to-do. In short, I refuse to accept the insurance principle. I refuse to accept the principle that the National Health Service should be paid by contributions. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept it because I thought it was nonsense. If you hadn't fully paid up, you couldn't have a second-class operation because your card wasn't full of stamps, could you?
There you go. The use of modern technology, wondrous things are possible. So that was Ira Bevan talking about his vision for the health system and why he opposed the principle, in principle, models like insurance. But when Bevan had got in as Minister for Health, the Labour Party's platform was progressive, but it was not actually to the point of what Bevan wanted to introduce. His plan for the NHS was the full nationalisation of all of Britain's hospitals and the bringing them under a centrally planned system in line with his view that socialism meant the development of a more rational, more centrally planned economy through a democratic state. So that was Bevan's plan, but it was actually against the the Labour Party policy at the time, because Bevan was arguing for and actually pursued a policy of the appropriation of private property in these hospitals by the government, something which he viewed as essential to any kind of socialised system. So Bevan ran ahead with his plans against the advice of the civil service at that time. And he ran into very significant opposition, of course, something that shouldn't be surprising when you're proposing to take a system that was substantially private, and even that which wasn't private, it was localized, it was independent, it was a system that enriched a small number of very wealthy medical professionals, and to try and make it into a socialist system. So when he proposed the legislation in '46, the opposition was extraordinary. The British Medical Association, which, as I said, was the organization of doctors, who in most of the countries of the world at this time, it is worth saying, opposed the introduction of proper public health services. Where I come from originally in Ireland, it was the same story. The British Medical Association threatened a boycott and to not participate any longer in the health system. Letters sent to the British Medical Journal were really extraordinary when you read them now. Bevan was compared regularly to Hitler, called a medical Führer. The president of the British Hospital Association actually accused him of mass murder and said that attempting to produce widespread changes in the health system would lead to chaos that would result in huge numbers of deaths down the road, and that the only change that should be done in health services was piecemeal. Against this wave of condemnation, against this extraordinary opposition, Bevan did have to make concessions. He would very famously say that he had stuffed their mouths with gold. This was his description of how he had managed to get the legislation over the line without a doctor's boycott, and that meant that obviously payments were quite high and quite a lot of money was contributed to the system. He also made structural concessions, which were important, which were that he allowed regional boards to continue to exist, which meant that it wasn't a fully centralized system, but the minister had final say, which was enough in his view. And the crucial one, the most important concession he made, which is still a concession that you live with now, was with the GPs. So instead of what he wanted, which was he wanted to bring all medical professionals in and make them salaried by the state. The GPs remained semi-independent, but they were controlled and they were dispersed in a way throughout the population that made access to healthcare far, far easier. In addition, of course, to their services being taken out of the market and made free at the point of access. So this was the balance that Bevan had struck. The Socialist Medical Association that I spoke about earlier, they thought that he'd given away more than he should have at that time, but I think in the cold light of day, looking at the history of it, the reality of a potential doctor boycott or mass strike of medical personnel, just as you were trying to roll out this system, was something that was wise for Bevan to try to avoid. And in the end, he got over the line the full nationalisation of the hospitals, the appropriation of the private property, the removal of charges, and a free system that was universal. And within a year of the NHS being introduced in July 5th, 1948, 90% of the population had been enrolled in this free, universal, and public system, which was an extraordinary thing at the time. And I want to read just a little bit here about from the leaflet that the government sent out at the time under Bevan's direction, which I think gives you a sense of what message was being given to people. So, yes, the leaflet said, "Your new National Health Service begins on the 5th of July. It will provide you with all medical, dental, and nursing care. Everyone, rich or poor, man, woman, or child, can use it or any part of it. There are no charges except for a few special items. There are no insurance qualifications. But it is not a charity. You are all paying for it, mainly as taxpayers, and it will relieve your money worries in times of illness." And that was the message that Bevan put across. When Bevan said years later that he was proud of the NHS and that it was a piece of real socialism, this is what he meant. His idea of socialism was that the most important parts in the first instance of people's lives would be taken out of the market, would be made available to everyone, and would have no cost barriers to entry. So this was his view of what a health system should mean. And it was one that he obviously built, an argument he built on one hand ideologically through his socialist politics, but on the other hand, it was an argument that he built practically through arguments around what healthcare was. And the idea, as we're all discovering now, that healthcare is a fundamentally socialist concept. That the arguments of the British right in the decades after Bevan, that there's no such thing as a society, was wrong and couldn't work in the world of healthcare, because the healthcare outcomes of one person are directly related to the practices and behaviors of other people. Something we now all know in the face of the coronavirus pandemic, and something that Bevan was very eloquent in making the case for at that time. I should say as well, Bevan, to some degree, had some knowledge of these things himself. Bevan had a deep appreciation throughout his life for people who had sicknesses and disabilities, because he had a very significant stammer from the time that he was young, something which when he was in school and in his early work life, he felt had really held him back. He believed that he probably would have convinced people of his intelligence far earlier and his ability to do more with his life if he had not had a stammer. And later on in life, Bevan would try to use this the stammer. He would use it as a kind of affectation during his speaking, but it was only after years of practice and the amassing of a huge vocabulary, which allowed him to avoid difficult words that he struggled to say, that Bevan was able to become this great political figure. The NHS that Bevan established was the first in the world to deliver comprehensive care, so not just to a section of the population or for a section of care, based on tax and not insurance. After the Soviet Semashko system, it was the first one that was genuinely fully nationalized. But the Semashko system, even through the middle of the 20th century, didn't cover all things and left out large sections of the population. It is worth saying, because these criticisms you will hear, of course, that the NHS cost more than Bevan predicted. When Bevan brought it in first, he estimated 170 million as its cost, and by 1951 it had cost 465 million. But why was that the case? Because once you opened the door to a public health system, what you found was that the masses of the population who had dealt with illnesses their whole lives, who had not been able to get medical care and who had had miserable lives because of it, came forward and accessed this system. So there was a report done in '56 called the Jacobin report, which said that increased cost of the NHS was not because of wastage. It was not because people were coming in for frivolous reasons. It was because people who couldn't see, people who couldn't walk, people who had had no dental care in their entire lives and were suffering through extraordinary pain, they came in en masse to this system. And what was discovered was Britain was an even sicker country than had been realized when people were making the assessments around the NHS. And something which, by the way, happens in almost every country where proper public health systems are introduced. It's only at that point you realize just how poor public health has been previously. In the 5 years after the NHS was introduced, it met with an 89% approval rating. GDP, the amount of GDP spent on healthcare doubled, going up by 1951 to 4.1% of GDP. And studies in the 1960s into the efficacy of this system produced really incredible results. It had managed to have infant mortality in that period of time. It had managed to halve the rate of premature deaths. It had managed to almost wipe out what were called unnecessary deaths for illnesses like I talked about earlier with tuberculosis and pneumonia and so on. And there was a six-fold increase in the number of people attending hospitals. And again, the own government reports made clear that this was not because of frivolous behavior, but because people needed it. This was a fundamentally political mission. It was the building of the National Health Service was the greatest achievement of the Labour movement in this country, without question. Nye Bevan was able to lead it because he had a clear ideological perspective on what healthcare should look like. You know, we all hear from middle of the road figures these days about the problems of ideology. And these people think of ideology as a weight around your ankle. And, you know, when a crisis comes, it's going to drag you under the waves. What Bevan understood was that ideology actually is the only thing that keeps you afloat. And having a political perspective on things like people's right to healthcare and the fact that the market is a fundamentally not just unjust, but exploitative way of providing the essentials in people's lives. Without that kind of perspective, you couldn't have had the incredible achievements of the National Health Service, which transformed healthcare outcomes in this country, which transformed the lives of working class people in this country, and which is now the most adored institution in the entirety of Britain. Sadly, this was not a perspective that was shared by all people in the political landscape, but as socialists, we knew this would be the case. The Tories voted multiple times against the introduction of the National Health Service at that time, but it wasn't even just the Tories who undermined Bevan's vision. In 1951, Nye Bevan resigned as Minister of Health because the Labour government, in order to contribute to the war effort in Korea, introduced prescription charges in the NHS, something that he felt was an intolerable contravention of his vision of socialist healthcare and public healthcare under the National Health Service. Bevan, of course, also had a famous line about the Tories at the time, a line which has come to be associated with him when he was describing the Tory opposition to the introduction of the National Health Service. Bevan would talk about the Tories as being lower than vermin. I'm trying to find the quote here. Here we are. Speaking of their objection to the introduction of the National Health Service and the frustration of that policy and their commitment to a health system which left so many people ill and ill-served. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, they are lower than vermin. They have condemned millions of people to semi-starvation, and they have not changed." And over the decades that came, the Tories proved Bevan right time and time and time again. Every time they got their hands on the public health system, they would decrease the spending as proportion of GDP. They would take more parts of it out of the public system and make them privately provided. And they would undermine the fabric that Bevan had installed, the socialist fabric that Bevan had installed in the NHS. In fact, when Labour left government in the 50s, it wasn't until the next Labour government came in that the percentage of GDP spent on healthcare went back to 4.1%. So the Tories systematically underfunded this new system. And of course, throughout the periods that followed, in the 70s and the 80s, with the battles over the economy, the NHS was undermined. It found itself victim of Labour parties turned to the right. It found itself victim of Thatcherism, and now, particularly since 2010, it has been systematically defunded and privatised. £15 billion worth of contracts have been sold to the private sector since 2015. We now have 40% of the cleaners of the hospitals, in the NHS, having privatized cleaning systems. And there has been a massive cut in funding. There's been a cut of pay, effectively, if you look at it, match it to inflation. There has been a denial of a pay rise to match inflation for 10 years to the NHS staff. There's something that people would do well to remember when we're clapping for the NHS here, which is, of course, exactly the right thing to do to show your appreciation for the battle that people at the front line are fighting against coronavirus, but is worth remembering when we see Boris Johnson out in the streets clapping along with the rest of us. So I want to finish with a little video from Bevan. And just before we get to that video, I want to speak about Bevan a little bit as a historical figure. Obviously, a tremendously inspiring historical figure, somebody we appreciate greatly in the Tribune tradition. They predicted when Bevan passed away, when he was this great and much adored figure of the working class movement, but they predicted the right wing when he passed away that he would be the last of his kind. A Conservative MP wrote in 1960 in the Evening Standard, he was the last of the demagogues. In the coal fields from which he came, Marx and Engels had been supplanted by Marx and Spencer, and the sound of class war is being drowned by the hum of the spin dryer. There will be no more Anaya and Bevans. That is the prediction that we all in this generation have to demonstrate to be false. The question of class struggle in our societies is as relevant today as it has ever been. The depths of inequality, the extreme suffering in places like queues for food banks in this country, people's attempt to access benefits and being sent through fit for work tests, the increases in child poverty, the scandalous situation with 0-hour contracts and precarious workers still now through the coronavirus pandemic being forced to go in to work in warehouses in unsafe conditions, even if they have underlying conditions themselves. There is no way that the struggle for healthcare, proper public healthcare, can be divorced from the struggle for class power and the upward march of the working class in a society. And this was something Bevan knew right to his dying days. The video we will now show you is Anaya and Bevan's final great speech, known as The Tides of History, where he spoke about the need for the socialist movement to keep its eye on the prize and to remember that the working class majority can be the base on which great social transformation can be built.
Father of modern democracy and of modern socialism, that we in Blackpool in 1959 are going to turn our backs on our principles because of the temporary unpopularity in a temporary affluent society? When we realize that all the tides of history are flowing in our direction, that we are not beaten, that we represent the future, then when we say it and mean it, we shall lead our people to where they deserve to be led.
Christian question. So I think now we're going to turn over to the question and answer section with Christy. And I'll see what you guys have been sending in. I couldn't see any of these questions, so I'm relying on Christian Baskar, who's somewhere behind the curtain out there, to send in the questions you guys have been asking about this struggle to build the NHS and the career of Anaya and Bevan. Christy?
All right, thank you so much, Ronan. As a reminder, if you are watching live, you can post your questions in the YouTube channel and we'll try our best to answer them. For those who may just be tuning in, tonight we're speaking with Ronan Burtenshaw. Ronan is editor-in-chief of the revitalized UK magazine, The Tribune, and former European editor of Jacobin. Tribune is set to have a series of upcoming articles on the pandemic, so please keep an eye out for those. You can find them at tribunemag.co.uk. So Ronan's just given us a fascinating and personally pretty moving to hear review of the history of the formation of the British National Health Service. And I hope in the questions here we can think a little bit more about the relevance of this history for our single payer organizing here in the US. I think there's a lot of questions that are raised and parallels that are drawn in hearing this history. And just as a reminder, this is part of Jacobin's Stay at Home series. We're taking tomorrow evening off, but on Monday, we'll have Karen Narewski on the case for public housing and why new public housing construction has to be part of the left's demands. And with that, so I think we can start getting to some of the questions for Ronan. The first was a question that asked, can Ronan say something about how doctors in the UK have historically related to the NHS? Was there resistance at first? What about now? Is there an internist versus specialist divide? Ronan.
Yes. So as I mentioned a little bit there was significant resistance. This was not universal. I mean, we shouldn't expect that in any profession, discipline, and so on. And without the Socialist Medical Association, which became Socialist Health Association, there would have been no National Health Service of the kind that developed. That's absolutely clear in my view. So doctors were very important for building the case for socialist medicine as well as opposing it. But the truth is that the bigger overarching organization, the British Medical Association, which is still around now as the BMA, was very opposed. They didn't want to see the power of doctors diminished, as Charles Webster, I quoted earlier on, talked about it. Basically, the doctors were running the health system before the NHS came in through a series of constant negotiations. So they didn't want that to change. They didn't want the money that doctors earned to fall away. And of course, at that time, like, the medical profession was even more rarefied than it is today. I mean, there is, in Britain, certainly, there's a much more popular element to the medical profession now than there was. Not to say it is, become proletarianized or anything, but it, more people can get into it from less well-off backgrounds. Whereas then it was much more the preserve of the upper classes. So yes, it's certainly true that there was opposition from doctors, but it was an opposition based on class. I don't think it's worth targeting doctors insofar as saying they were opposing it because of something particular to their being doctors. They were opposing it to something particular to their class position. And now the BMA fights for a public health system. There are other unions in the health service too, like Unite, who represent doctors as well. And these fight for a public health system. They fight to defend the NHS. And actually, the BMA led a junior doctors strike quite recently against the Tory government in defence of the conditions of NHS workers. So I think that scenario has changed to some degree.
Great, thank you. Our next question from the channel is, before the NHS's founding, was it common for labour unions in the UK to bargain for health insurance programs for their members? Was that a barrier within Labour as it can be within Medicare for All organising in the US today, if you're familiar with that debate?
Yeah, I know the one. We were all following with Nevada and so on, these debates in the US, what happened with Bernie's campaign, and we want to, from here, to give our continued solidarity and support to Comrade Bernie Sanders and his fight to win the presidency in the US, and also to build the first mass socialist movement in the United States in generations, something which all of you who are involved in should be deeply proud of your contribution to. There was, to some degree, I mean, like I said, in 1911, the National Insurance Act was introduced in Britain, which meant that health insurance was divvied out through the workplace. Now, I would say this, that the British system had a much clearer general line, like a baseline, from which no worker could go below, which meant that you didn't have to do quite the same level of horse trading as you do in the United States. But yes, unions did argue and fight with their employers to try and get improvements beyond the National Insurance Act. A reminder again, what that meant was that your insurance was tied to your place of work. It was only for workers, so it wasn't for their families. It only dealt with GP care. It didn't deal with hospital care. But those things were at least, guaranteed by the 1911 Insurance Act. That meant that, unemployed people, women, children, elderly people. Like there was huge numbers left out, and so by 1938, only 43% of the population was covered. But even those who were covered, yes, you did have some union negotiations on top to try to secure access. But the most important thing that was in existence in Britain, and it is worth saying again, were these friendly societies. So the labour movement, 6 times as many workers at the turn of the century were in the friendly societies as were in the trade union movement. Right, so they were huge organisations to try to pool together workers' funds to provide access to decent quality healthcare. And they were, yes, they were bigger than the trade union movement, but as the trade union movement grew, they very much were marching side by side. And so you ended up with the union movement putting a lot of effort into the development of these friendly societies around workplaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would like to see something like that here rather than later. Next question. What was the concrete political demand for the NHS before the NHS itself existed? For example, was there a parliamentary bill for the NHS, like Bernie's Medicare For All bill or the Jacobin bill in the House, that the left used to organize campaigns around?
So it's worth remembering, right? The NHS comes out of the Second World War, which meant, that there was a kind of national coalition government in place beforehand that made political demands through Parliament more difficult. I mean, Nye Bevan, of course, tried to raise these in his role as an MP, but it was not a comparable situation in that sense to the US. The demands were different depending on who you were looking at. Obviously, like I said, the kind of paternalistic liberal elements of politics would have gathered around ideas similar to Beveridge's one, which is we need a social safety net, but it should be one provided on an insurance basis. It was kind of, instead of about empowering workers, it was about looking after the poor. And so that was one set of demands for a welfare state that existed. The Labour Party and the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, had adopted motions in favour of national health services in the 1920s and 30s, but these were much weaker, to be frank, than what Bevan went for in the end. Like, for instance, as I said, the Labour Party one didn't call for the full nationalisation of the hospitals by the time Bevan had arrived as Minister of Health. And then, you would have got elements in the Tory party who, through the emergency hospital service in the Second World War, where they had begun to centralise and rationalise the provision of hospital care, they would have argued for that to be extended and for a centralised system, but not one that was really public and free. Bevan was the Tribune of the left at that time. He was the most powerful figure of the left. He edited Tribune actually itself at a time when it was vastly more widely read than today. We're doing okay, but Bevan he was printing 200,000 copies. We'll take a while to get there. He was editor between 41 and 45, so right up until he became Minister of Health. And through that, he used Tribune to campaign, and the demand was straightforward. On the one hand, it was to rationalise and centrally plan a health service on socialist lines, but in terms of outward-facing demands to the public, it was that it would be free, that it would be public, that it would be universal. Mm-hmm. That you had to take healthcare out of the market, out of the predations of the commodity circulation, mm-hmm. and you had to make it available to the people as a right.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's that clarity of taking healthcare off the marketplace that you were talking about as an essential kind of vision that he had that kind of led and carried forward this movement toward the NHS. I think it seems like it was critical. Something that we try to do within the healthcare organizing in the US around the DSA is to have 5 principles that guide our kind of what would constitute a truly robust single payer system that include a lot of what you've been saying, but essentially just completely taking healthcare off of the marketplace and treating it as a human right. So I think we have time for one more question. The last question that we have time for is, to what extent did the socialist and labor movements develop the technocratic infrastructure for those NHS medical boards in advance versus them arising out of necessity and being sort of put together
These are really good questions. These are like very, very good, technically savvy questions coming out of obviously a movement that fight for Medicare for All in the US, which is thinking about these things.
Mm.
I would say the technical expertise to some degree was built up through the friendly societies. By the time you get to the 20s and 30s, particularly, right, the friendly societies are these mass organizations, which in places like Tredici are running their own hospitals, right? So they're coordinating their own provision of healthcare, and they have an understanding of what is going to be necessary to put together trusts and boards and so on in a nationalized system, partly because they had made these structures before the development of the NHS through workers' organisation. And that was important, there's no doubt about it. You also, of course, had some experience in the Labour Party of having been in government previously. So the Labour Party, yes, was in government with Ramsay MacDonald and that calamity, but it still meant that the Labour Party and movement had some experience of knowing what it meant to have your hands on the machinery of the state, and had tried to introduce progressive measures then. They had seen obviously what happened there and the kind of pressure that came on a Labour government and how it broke apart under the pressure of the Great Depression, and the demands for austerity from the ruling class. So you had some experience there with the state. You had some experience through the Second World War. There's an excellent book called People's War, which I would advise people to pick up and read. And which discusses the kind of grassroots working class movements around the Second World War in Britain and the organisation of workers and how they managed to exert political power through that period of the Second World War. And that describes as well some of what was happening, which was that, the provision of services, the organisation of communities, that had begun to happen through the workers' movement in that Second World War period in a way that then obviously workers were not prepared to give up once the war ended and they voted out the Tories and voted in the Labour Party. So you had these different ways in which technical expertise was built up, from the friendly societies through to the Labour movement being in government, and also through to working class self-organization during the Second World War.
Mm. Thanks so much, Ronan. I think there's so much here to think about in the U.S. context, especially as we kind of yearn for and fight to organize a revitalized labor movement in the U.S., which seems so played such a critical part in the formation of the NHS in the UK. I think we have much more to think about in terms of how to bring a revitalized labor movement together with our single payer organizing. And I look forward to